All right, guys, so let's take a look at our distance formula. What we're going to be looking at our distance formula is basically the distance between 2 points. One thing that I can give you the question, I can give you the coordinates of the points, and then figure what the distance is given the coordinates. Or I can give you a graph, and then from there you guys figure it out. So two things though. So I'm gonna look at the distance of the formulas. The way that the formula derived, the formula was derived was using Pythagorean theorem. So I'm not gonna break it down like how it got derived. I can show you individually if you want me to show you how it got derived. I'm just gonna straight out tell you how to do it. So let me actually take a look at the work. Let me just come and maximize the question here. I'm gonna come and say find a distance between each pair of points. Round your answer to the nearest tenth. So I'm just gonna come and remind you guys of when you guys were covering the last year when you guys were covering slopes. Remember, you guys had a formula for the slope. It was the m was y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. Remember, you guys talked about how to find the slopes of that. It was like the second y minus the first y. So based on that idea, I'm gonna start it the same way. So looking at our work here, I'm gonna go -2 minus a -1, right? The second y minus the first y over -x minus 2. So I'm gonna start it like that. Then I know on the top a minus a negative that changes to plus. And then so on the top I have a -1, and at the bottom I have a -8. Right? That was on slope. Like I'm starting kind of like how we used to do slopes. And I know on slopes you guys had to simplify the fraction, right? And that was your slope. Now for distance, I'm gonna start like that, but do not simplify fractions. So if you have, like, for example, 6/8, we're gonna use a 6, we're gonna use the 8. Do not simplify fractions. To find the formula to find the distance, I'm gonna do a square root. So I'm gonna do square root, and in this case, I'm gonna go 1 squared plus 8 squared. You guys see where I got my 1 and my 8. I know on my work they're negatives. I'm ignoring the negatives because technically whenever you square a number, you convert it into positive. So if I put -1 squared, it's the same thing as 1 squared, right? Because then the squares are going to make it into positive. I know 1 squared is 1. So when I look at this, 1 squared is 1. 8 squared is 64. So I'm looking at the square root of 65, right? 1 plus 64. So once again, I started the same way I did slopes. That's how I got my 1 and my 8. Then I'm going to do the square root of 1 squared plus 8 squared. And then I'm going to have the square root of 65. Now for this one, square root of 65 is not a perfect square, right? So in this case, I'm going to use my calculator. And I'm going to figure out what square root of 65 is. So 65, the square root of that. According to my calculator, I get 8.06225, whatever. I'm running that to the nearest tenth. So I'm going to say this is about 8.1. Right? Tenth sounds like the number 10, which has 1 0. So 1 decimal place. If I ever ask you guys to run it to nearest hundredth, sounds like 100, 2 zeros, 2 decimal places. So nearest tenth is 1 decimal place. Once again, it was like 8.06 and some more numbers. So that's why I run it to 8.1. That's it. My answer is 8.1. Once again, given the coordinates, start it the way you know how to do slope, and then you're going to do the square root, square each of them, and add them up. Let me take a look. Well, better yet, any questions on these? Remember, when I say any questions, I can come up with different examples. So, any questions on these? Do another example? All right. So let's take a look at this example. So once again, I'm going to start it as if I was doing the slope. So I'm going to think of 7 minus a -3, right? The second y minus the first y. So that's 7 minus a negative 3. At the bottom, I'm going to do 6 minus 3. Right? The second x minus the first x. Right? That's how we do slopes. On the top, 7 minus 3 is becomes like a plus 3. So 10. At the bottom, 6 minus 3 is 3. If the fraction could be simplified, do not simplify it. Like in this case, we cannot. But if it could, do not simplify. Now the distance is going to be the square root of 10 squared plus 3 squared. I know 10 squared is 100. 3 squared is 9. So I'm looking at the square root of 109. Because I am going to add those. Then I'm going to grab my calculator. The square root of 109, according to my calculator, is like 10.44. It gives me 10.44. So I'm going to round this to 10.4. My answer will be 10.4. Right? We know how to round things up, right? If the second number is 5 or more, bring this 4 higher. If it's 4 or less, leave it alone. So that's why I call it 10.4. Any questions on these? So some questions, like I said, is going to be numerical. Some other questions, I'm going to give you guys a graph. I want to find out what's the length of that segment, which is the distance of the 2 points. If you notice the coordinates of one of my points, let me get the coordinates of each of my points. One of my points, the coordinates of it are -3, 4. Right? Coordinates of that point. If I look at the other point, the coordinates are 2, 0. Right? We can find the coordinates of each. Now that I have the numbers, I'm going to do what I just did on my previous examples. I have the coordinates. So which point is the first point, which point is the second point? It doesn't matter. I'm going to call this my second point, and I'm going to call this my first point. It doesn't matter. So now what I'm going to do for my slope, I'm going to go 4 minus 0 over -3 minus 2. So on the top, 4 minus 0 is 4. At the bottom, -3 minus 2 is -5. Do not simplify the fraction. This one we cannot, but even if you could, do not simplify. When I'm going to find a distance, I'm going to go 4 squared plus 5 squared. Once again, I ignore the negative sign on the 5 because once I square it, it becomes positive anyway. So ignore the negative sign. So I have 4 squared plus 5 squared, which is the same thing as 16 plus 25. 16 plus 25, what's that, 41? So the square root of 41. I'm going to use a calculator to find out what the square root of 41 is. And this thing gives me 6.4. I rounded my answer to the nearest tenth. Like there were more decimals, but I rounded to 6.4. So start it the way you're going to do a slope. Do not simplify the fraction. Just use those two numbers. In this case, a 4 and a 5. 4 squared plus 5 squared inside the square root, and you're good to go. Like I said, it got derived from the distance formula. And then, from slope, from Pythagorean theorem. A squared plus B squared equals C squared. Because I don't want to confuse you, but if you guys want to see how it got derived, I can show you. All right. Any questions on these? No? And then on your homework, I'm also going to, just to review a little of yesterday, I'm going to give you guys something like this. Classify if each angle is acute, obtuse, right, or straight. My angle is 89 degrees, which is between 0 and 90. So acute, right? So we're going to use acute. Are we good? Just a little, tomorrow, we have a quiz, right? We have our quiz for the week. Tomorrow, let me just come and review a little for the quiz. There's 10 questions. So let me ignore this. I'm going to just abbreviate this. So there's 10 questions. The first one, I'm going to give you guys an angle. Let's say I give you guys this angle, and then I call it, let's say A there, a B there, and a C there, and a number 2 there. And then I'm going to ask you, give me 4 names for that angle. I know in the homework I ask you